What's going on, everybody? I'm Johnny Brook. Welcome back to another Crafted Workshop video. In today's video, I am following up with part 2 of the Rubo workbench project. I'm going to be finishing the workbench in this video. In part 1, in case you missed it, I built the bench top and installed the wagon vise. And in part 2 here, I'm going to be finishing the base and installing the leg vise and getting the workbench totally complete. So I am extremely excited to have this thing done and in my shop. I think it's going to be incredibly useful for me. And again, I do have plans available if you want to check those out. I'll have a link in the video description below. Also, I'm going to be giving those plans away for free to all of my patrons over on Patreon. So if you want to join up, now is a really good time to do that. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started.
So I started the base by working on the legs. The legs are made up of 3 laminated pieces with the center lamination cut longer. This creates the tenon without having to actually cut it later on and makes the process a lot simpler. I cut the pieces to length at the miter saw and then squared them up on the jointer, planer, and table saw. Once the pieces were squared up, I needed to glue them up. Since the tenons will be created during the glue up, I needed to be really precise about the alignment here, so I used dominoes to help with the alignment. You could also use biscuits or dowels here. I clamped the legs up and let them dry. After they dried, I squared them up at the jointer and planer, making sure to remove an even amount from both faces of the legs so that the tenons would stay centered. Finally, I cut the legs to their final length of 29 inches. Next, I needed to lay out the mortise locations on the bottom of the bench top. I used the legs themselves to mark out the mortise location. This makes sure the mortises are exactly sized to the tenons. Once the mortise locations were marked out, I cleared out the bulk of the mortises with an 1.5 inch long straight cutting router bit. I plunged to final depth at either end of the mortise and then took several passes to get to final depth along the whole wall of the mortise. I used an edge guide to keep the router lined up with the sides of the mortise, and once I had one half of the mortise cut, I moved the bit over and cut the other half, staying just shy of the line. I snuck up on the exact fit of the mortise until the tenon fit snugly. So with the majority of the waste removed, I cleaned up the corners with the chisel, squaring them off. Once the corners were squared up, I test fit the tenons until they fit nicely. And as you can see, there's a gap at the shoulder line on the legs, and that's because I purposely left the tenons longer than they needed to be. Once they were all fit nicely, I trimmed the tenons to length at the miter saw. So with the legs done, I moved on to working on the stretchers that connect the legs to each other, as well as the leg vise chop. The stretchers are made up of 2 4.5 inch wide laminations, and the leg vise chop is made up of 2 full width pieces of 2x10. I ripped the 2x10s for the stretchers on the table saw and then skip planed everything at the planer. With everything skip planed, I glued all the laminations together, just trying to keep everything as straight as possible. Once the glue dried, I squared up the pieces, first cutting the leg vise chop to 8 inches wide, then squaring up 2 faces on the jointer. I then squared up 2 faces of the stretchers at the jointer, and then planed the opposing faces on all the pieces on the planer. Finally, I ripped the opposing faces of the stretchers on the table saw, and cut the leg vise chop to rough length at the miter saw. You want to leave your leg vise a little long here, just so you can plane it flush with your bench top later on. Next, I needed to lay out the locations for the leg vise screw hole, as well as the mortise location for the bench-crafted crisscross. In case you're not familiar with the crisscross, it's a piece of hardware that eliminates the need for a parallel guide in a leg vise. So the exact locations of the mortise and the vise screw hole are all detailed in the plans, and those again are available in the video description below. So with the locations marked out, I cleared out the bulk of the waste using an 1 5/8" Forstner bit on the drill press, and there's an identical mortise on both the leg as well as the leg vise chop for the crisscross. Once the bulk of the waste was cleared, I came back with my router with the edge guide to cut the mortise to its final size. I made sure to remove equal amounts from each side of the mortise to keep it centered in the leg vise chop as well as the leg, and I just snuck up on the final width, checking it along the way with calipers. After cutting the mortise to its final width and depth, I squared up the corners with a chisel, and then installed the metal plate that the bench crafted crisscross rides on. I then repeated the process on the mortise on the leg, cutting it to width with the router, then squaring up the ends with the chisel. Next, I drill a hole through the side of the leg vise chop and the leg the vise will be mounted to accept the steel rods that are used to mount the crisscross. I then drilled the hole that the leg vise screw travels through, and I used a 2 9/16" hole saw for this. I unfortunately had a terrible angle for this, all you can see really is the back of my arm, but it's basically just drilling a big hole, so I think you get the idea. With the mortises for the leg cut, I could move on to getting the base finished. So I trimmed the stretchers to their final length on the miter saw, making sure to account for the length of the tenons, and then started creating the tenons on the table saw. To do this, I first cut the shoulder line on each side of the stretcher. I just set up a spacer block so that I could butt the piece up against it and then push it through the blade using my miter sled. After cutting a shoulder line on one side of the piece, I rotated it 90 degrees and then repeated this process all the way around the stretcher. And if your saw and sled are 90 degrees and you take your time, these cuts should line up perfectly all the way around the stretcher. Once the shoulder line was cut on all of the stretchers, I switched over to a dado stack to remove the rest of the waste from the tenon. I made sure to set the height exactly the same so that the shoulder line lined up with the rest of the tenon, and I used a set of brass spacer blocks to do this. And I just repeated this process on all of the stretchers. With all the tenons cut, I laid out the mortise locations on the legs. To do this, I put all the legs together and then laid out the mortise locations on all the legs at once, and this just helped to ensure that they all lined up properly later on. To cut the mortises, I used a new to me tool that I picked up used on Craigslist. It's an older hollow chisel mortiser. So in case you're not familiar with this tool, it basically is similar to a drill press, except that it has a square chisel on the end as well, and it allows you to cut square holes. So I set the fence and then made a pass on all the legs with a 1/2 inch chisel, and then moved the fence over a 1/2 inch, and then made a second pass to get my mortise to its final width of 1 inch. As you can see, the tool creates a perfectly square mortise, and as long as you follow your layout lines, it will create a nice snug fit. So while I'm mortising here, let's talk about the sponsor of today's video, and that's Waterlocks. I'll be using Waterlocks to finish the workbench after making sure nothing needs to be tweaked over the next few weeks, so stay tuned to my social media to see a video of the finish being applied. Waterlocks is a blend of tung oil and resins and creates a really tough, water-resistant finish that's perfect for a workbench, and will also keep glue from sticking to the workbench. To learn more about Waterlocks, check out the link in the video description below. With all the mortises cut and fitted, I trimmed the tenons to their final length on the miter saw. Next, I glued up the base. This wasn't particularly difficult. I just applied glue to all the tenons and then clamped up the base. You might also notice that I accidentally cut one of the stretchers too short and had to use dominoes to attach it, but this didn't really matter in the end. Also, while I had the base upside down, I chamfered the edges of the feet, and this will keep the edges from blowing out when I slide the bench around on my shop floor. Once the base had dried, I then attached it to the bench top. Again, I just applied glue to the tenons and mortises and then clamped the base to the top. Some of these joints were really tight, so it took a little persuasion, but I eventually got everything tightened down. So with the base attached to the top, the bench structure itself is done. So next came the task of flattening the bench top. And there are a handful of really great videos out there on this topic, and I'll have links to these in the video description. Luckily, my top was really flat right off the bat with no twist whatsoever, and I really just needed to clean up a few of the ridges between the different sections that were glued together. I started by planing diagonally in both directions using my low angle jack plane, and this just evens everything out. I used a 25-degree bevel angle plane iron for this, And after everything was even, I switched to my 38-degree bevel angle plane iron and smoothed everything out, removing any of the tear out caused during the diagonal planing. The 38-degree really smooths things out nicely, and I was getting nice long shavings the full length of the bench. So with the top flattened, I could drill the dog holes into the dog block and along the front edge of the bench. I used a dog hole bushing from Lee Valley and created a quick jig to drill these holes, using a few pieces of scrap 3/4 inch plywood. Basically, the jig just hooks over the front edge of the bench so that all the holes are an even distance from the front edge, and the bushing helps to keep the drill bit perpendicular to the bench top. So I drilled a hole in the center of the dog block and then drilled holes spaced roughly 3.5 inches on center along the length of the bench. The 2 holes that ended up over the legs will have some of the Veritas Prairie Dogs installed in them, and these can pop up and be retracted below the surface of the bench, and you don't need access to the underside of the hole. So with all the dog holes drilled, I could finally try the wagon vise that I installed in the previous video, and it works incredibly well. Planing the face of boards is going to be a breeze from now on. So next, I shaped the leg vise chop at the bandsaw and jointer, and I just cut a simple angle on it. I then attached the crisscross to the vise chop using the included steel rod, and I did need to trim the length down a little bit. With that in place, I attached the crisscross to the leg using the other steel rod. So with the leg vise chop in place, I moved on to installing the vise hardware. So first, I attached the vise screw to the chop using the brass garter that's included with the Lake Erie Toolworks kit. To space the screw evenly in the leg vise chop, I wrapped a piece of paper around it a few times and taped that into place. And then I pushed the vise screw up against the chop and marked the location of the hole I needed with a cinder punch. I removed the vise screw and then pre-drilled the hole in the location I marked, and then threaded the screw in using a screwdriver, and then marked and drilled the other hole locations and threaded in the screws. With all the holes drilled, I removed the garter and then attached the vise screw using the garter. So with the vise screw in place, I installed the nut to the back of the leg. The key here is to make sure the screw's travel is in line with the crisscross, and I actually had to shim the nut a little bit to make this work properly, and I just attached this with 4 3.5 inch long screws. Next, I added a small chamfer to the sides of the leg vise chop, and then flushed it up with the top of the workbench using my low angle jack plane. Finally, I added a heavy chamfer to the front edge, and this just allows for angled handsaw work without the leg vise chop getting in the way. With the leg vise installed, the workbench is complete, and now let's demo the leg vise in action.
All right, so let's check out the holding power of the leg vise. So the beauty of the crisscross mechanism down here is you don't have to mess with the parallel guide. Just tighten it down, and the bench will move before your workpiece. So, as you can see, it comes out nice and easy. So this is probably going to be, to me, the most useful part of this workbench, just having a really wide mouth vise. It's very quick to adjust. As you can see, the beautiful thing about this wooden screw is that it opens really quickly. So, and you got tons and tons of room there. So, and this is before I've even finished the vise screw and applied any paste wax. So it's going to be even smoother once it's done. So there you go. That's the leg vise. All right, hopefully you guys enjoyed this one. This was a pretty intense project. I mean, there is a lot going on here, a lot of firsts for me. It was actually really good practice for traditional mortise and tenon joinery. I haven't really done much of that at all, so it was really cool to be able to do that both with the router and with the hollow chisel mortiser. I know that's gonna be very helpful to have that kind of experience under my belt on some upcoming projects. So hopefully you guys enjoyed this one. Again, I do have plans available for this. If you wanna check those out, I have a link in the video description below. Also in the video video description, I have links to all the products I used in this video. Last, if you want to support me on Patreon, again, all of my patrons are getting these plans for free, so now is a great time to join. I'll have a link to go check me out on Patreon as well. Thanks again for watching, everybody, and until next time, happy building.